Welcome to this next video in this series on William Golding's Lord of the Flies. We'll be focusing on chapter 4 next, following our explorations of the themes of things like law and order, civility versus savagery, as the novel really starts to accelerate in terms of its narrative trajectory, and we really start to see some of the wider issues coming to bear more fully. Now, as we move through the novel, we're going to move towards a series of big questions in each video that we want to answer. That'll help us bring in some of the themes and analysis, as well as encouraging us to really closely explore some of the key questions and key issues that Golding raises in his novel. So, in chapter 4, we'll be thinking about why Golding focuses on the cruelty that the boys demonstrate. We'll be thinking about the characters, their actions, but also what they signify and represent. And remember that representation remains a really important part of our study. We'll go on and think about the fact that Piggy has intellect versus some of the more savage, base functions of the boys and base actions and savage actions of the boys. And we'll think about why is he shunned, why is he ostracised, why is he pushed to the edge of society on the island. And then we'll consider finally that the island is dividing. The boys, the society that the boys has formed on the island is dividing. And we'll think about why and what that says about democracy and law and order more widely. And running through all of this increasingly is going to be that question of cruelty, that sadistic nastiness that the boys start to demonstrate. And we'll look at Roger, some of his motives, and we'll question some of those aspects and elements, what they might signify, and how Golding might be playing on some of the historical and contextual issues that he faced in the time. So we're going to start looking at this chapter now, chapter 4, and we are going to be thinking all the time about three core big questions. Why does Golding focus on the cruelty of the boys? The fact that Piggy has intellect and why he is shunned. And then if the island is dividing, why? And what does this say about democracy? The references to Roger that I mentioned earlier in the chapter, there's some kind of gamesmanship about stone throwing, but here we're focusing on the core central event of the chapter where the boys have hunted a pig, killed the pig, and have allowed the fire to go out. So you can see I've already been through this passage, which you can read separately, but this is the moment Ralph is looking as Jack returns with the pig, the killed pig that they've slaughtered. So we start with this word, a procession. It seems ceremonial. And when we have a ceremony, there is a sense here of celebration. There is a sense of enjoying the violence. They are relishing it. And there's two reasons for this. It could be partly because they are celebrating and they are seeing this as a positive event for the boys as a whole. But equally, there is something communal about a procession, something about them doing it together. There is something ordered about this. There is, in some sense, that it's violence that has been authorised. And we'll see shortly that this is a point that comes under debate, that this violence, the killing of the pig, should not have been authorised. And then we have this fascinating image that Golding introduces of the boys and the hunters of the choir had their black caps left over, but they were almost naked. So we have this juxtaposition. They've just got their black caps left, but they're almost naked. So instead, we have the balance between civility and savagery tipping away from civilization. Until this point of the novel, Golding has held civility and savagery almost in tension, in a balance. But now we're starting to see the boys as a community moving away from that increasingly rapidly, increasingly quickly. And then we have this further contrast. So we can go from a procession and then we have this chanting. So we have this movement towards a ritual. the sense that this is this violence enacted towards the sow, remembering, of course, that the sow is the female pig. The female pig can produce a litter, can keep producing young animals for the boys to eat, so they could live on the island for longer. But instead it's ritual, and it's ritual slaughter. The boys have lost the sense of survival, and instead they relish in the success of their violence. So we have that incredibly strong imagery and symbolism just in this first paragraph of this passage. That balance of the procession, it's ordered, it's authorised, it's ceremonial, but also chanting. There's the ritual coming through, the sense that this is a process that will be repeated time and time again, as well as a juxtaposition between the last remaining vestiges, the leftovers of civilization in the black caps, versus their nakedness, moving towards being savages, towards being less than human. And the narrator, Golding has his narrator focus then, and I'll just change colour so you can see us move our focus from Simon first, because it's Simon who sees and perceives, and he goes from Ralph to Jack. So Golding has Simon register the tipping point, move from order to chaos, from the order and democracy, the familiar safety of democracy that Ralph represents, towards the cruelty that Jack represents. And this is the point. Jack and the choir, the hunters as they become, they relish violence. So Golding really is showing that violence takes over and consumes. And then if we go wider, particularly thinking about all of the contextual issues from the first couple of videos, is that the desire for control over the world leads to brutality every time. We're just going to bring in this repeated quotation. We've talked about the procession, the chanting, that sense of ceremony. I'm just going to go back to blue so you can see the connection as we move through the passage. But we have this chant, kill the pig, cut her throat, split her blood. It is a repeated chorus now. And we hear it again and again throughout the course of the novel. Crucially, when Simon is killed. And we hear it again. This is associated with the disaster on the island. What does that represent? Because that's what we have to always think about. Well, this represents the failure of order, but also perhaps Golding represents the failure of British exceptionalism, the idea that the British are better and somehow different. So that's really going towards that question. Why does Golding focus on the cruelty of the boys? Well, we see that the cruelty, the violence of the boys is associated with disaster. That goes on to suggest the failure of order and democracy, and perhaps then the failure of this British exceptionalism as well. Now, the next thing that I had highlighted was the fact that the narrator, and the Golding has the narrator note that Simon was afraid. So we have the fact here that Simon recognises this disaster. One of our big questions is that Piggy has intellect. Why is he shunned? We know that Piggy represents this intellectual reason, and we'll look again more closely at that in the next chapter. But here, equally, if we broaden our question out, if Piggy has intellect, why is he shunned? Well, if Simon can perceive why is he shunned, well, he is able to see the disaster that the rest of the boys are engaging in. He is able to see it, and he truly fears it. The fact that he is afraid of this perhaps suggests that we all should fear human nature. We should fear humanity's destructive potential. And we even see that. We even see the organisation of that as we move through this passage. These quick exchanged bits of dialogue amongst the choir as they hunted. The way in which violence can be quickly orchestrated and executed. The killing of the sow, the killing of this pig, this mother pig, is quick and seems easy. And it's certainly easier than setting up a camp or safety for a long period of time. The democracy Golding might be representing is hard and challenging to sustain in the face of immediate desires and needs. But let's not forget, this sow has been killed. The sow that could reproduce, that could produce more food for the boys on the island. But they've taken the quick step. They've killed it really quickly and suddenly. And indeed, Golding likes to keep holding ideas in balance and intention. So up here we've already talked about the fact that the black caps are there versus the choir being almost naked. And we have another opposition. We have them dancing. Okay, we have Jack dancing and then suddenly remembering his dignity. So we have another opposition. It's almost as though Jack's previous identity as a British schoolboy reasserts and is remembered. That democratic values can be refound and rediscovered. But Golding shows us these being dismissed as the novel progresses. The same pattern happens again immediately afterwards. He sees the blood. He grimaces. He sees that it's distasteful, disgusting, repulsive and repugnant. He then wipes that blood away and laughs. So it's almost as though, as we bring these little elements together here, that violence can be easily shrugged off. That destruction and death are a game. And Golding warns us against trivialising, making light of cruelty. But this question of division is really being spoken to clearly in this chapter. The boys, the choir, are celebrating. But here,
Ralph spoke. You let the fire out. We have this division amongst the boys. It's now becoming clearer and more distinct. There is a real separation happening between Ralph, perhaps a figure that represents the importance of democratic values, versus Jack and the choir and increasingly the rest of the island. And that is really reinforced through this monosyllabic language. It's harsh. It's frustrated. I think to me there's almost a sense that it's disbelieving of the other's foolishness. He is incredulous. It's a kind of fury, a disbelieving fury. And in the face of that, of course, they quickly say, and Jack says, I cut the pig's throat, replying in monosyllables. But again, we have that balance. Golding keeps coming back to these tensions. Jack is proud of that violence, but he twitches. We have the boys celebrate and be repulsed at the same time. Golding shows us a repressed response to violence again and again and again. And of course that's quickly suppressed even further because Jack lavishes in this. He enjoys this scale and spectacle. And that's the cruelty, it's the spectacle of cruelty. And we see this in literature more widely outside of Lord of the Flies. You know, we think about the other texts that you're studying. There's an argument to say that Shakespeare lavishes in the spectacle of cruelty in Macbeth. But we lavish in this. There is a sense of enjoyment. It's sadistic. There's an enjoyment in the cruelty. And this enjoyment of cruelty suppresses reason and rationality and civility. And that word suppresses is really important because it's about preventing things from happening. We have, though, this repeated warning. You let the fire out twice. Ralph has a singular focus of being rescued, and Golding is representing the desire to return to society. That is held in balance, in contrast to the way violence is relished and enjoyed. Golding, of course, is responding to a decade and century in the early part of the 20th century where there's no question there was huge violence. The world recovering from violent, brutal wars, but also the looming threat of dictators and dictatorships, as well as existing in that period of tension during the Cold War. And there is that same balance, that same conflict between those that would use violence to enforce a political perspective, remove democracy, remove freedom of speech, those absolutely central values that we value and that we take advantage of today. And Golding is showing us that freedom of speech and democracy can be lost in the face of violence, ceremony, because let's not forget, this pig is brought in as a procession with chanting, this ceremony, and it's lost in the face of violence and ceremony, of enjoyment, of power, because that's ultimately what Jack does. He exerts power over one of the natural figures on the island. And indeed, it is that repetition. Jack holds his point. Jack holds the line. There is a momentary uncertainty. Again, there is a lingering possibility that disaster could be averted. We know, obviously, from our reading of this novel that disaster is not averted. The island finishes on fire, the boys end up divided. But we have, again, the island dividing. We have this sense that democracy is uneasy, unstable, is fleeting, it's mutable, it can be lost. But there is this sense of embarrassment, the face flushing, going red. And there is then the excuse that reason and rationality, that Piggy stands for, had been suspended with the fire going out. That fire represents reason, rationality, because they can be saved by having that fire. With it out, reason and rationality being suspended. It is this somewhat lazy notion that democratic values are easy to find again. And Golding shows us that once it has been lost, democracy can be hard to find again. So in the next part of this video, we will look at tracking and tracing some of these key ideas across the novel, and then we will bring together our responses to our three big questions. So we're now coming to this track and trace activity. Again, it should be familiar from the first two videos, but this is a way of essentially structuring your essay where you start in one section of the novel, you might comment on one section of the novel. And I'd start with this repeated quotation: "Kill the pig, split her throat, spill her blood." I'd stress that it's repeated. It is associated with increasing violence. This symbolises the breakdown of order on the island. Kill, split and spill. Three key words, three verbs, three violent and clumsy verbs. The process of losing civility is clumsy and harmful. And these are all monosyllables as well, single syllable words. So we can focus in here as well. We have these monosyllables. They are blunt. They are simplistic. Very much like the action of killing the pig. Superficially, on the surface, simplistic. Underneath, damaging, destructive, and more complex and more profound. So as we continue to move through the novel, we're going to go to later, as Simon looks at the Lord of the Flies. So remembering the Lord of the Flies is the pig's head that's been cut off, And it's Simon who sees the Lord of the Flies. It's Simon who sees the Lord of the Flies and its reflection of humanity as well as its hellish connotations. And here we're thinking about this central theme of cruelty and the cruel nature of humanity as a core theme. So it's building on that theme of savagery we've looked at in the first videos in this series. And here, the core issue is that Golding is showing us the true, brutal nature of humanity. And let's not forget, it's Simon who was scared of this. Simon fears this. He fears this true version of humanity. It's this idea that the beast is not something you can hunt and kill. These are almost childish notions. They are fanciful. They are a fancy. They are immature notions. Actually, the desire to kill, the sadistic quality of it, enjoying the violence, it's part of humanity. And the fact that we can't hunt it down, we can't kill it, we can't just wipe out this part of humanity. Golding shows us that this brutality is part of all of us. And, we think about the passage we've just read, we see that tension being held all the time. And then later in the novel, we see violence being done, violence being meted out. He began to pound them out below him, using his clenched fist as a hammer. He hit with more and more force, more and more passionate hysteria as the face became slippery. This idea of the face becoming slippery, it doesn't say that the face is bleeding or damaged or harmed, but the face is clearly becoming bloody. It's almost becoming unrecognisable. But we're not seeing this. We're not seeing this. We're not seeing it described as blood or as violence. It's just the face is becoming slippery, as though the blood itself is no longer being seen. And in this moment, Ralph is being dehumanized. Okay, he isn't identified at this moment later in the novel. Ralph is no longer seen as a human. He has his identity taken. He is a victim. He is only a collection of body parts. It's as though a human can be reduced to nothing. And the clenched fist as a hammer. So whilst Ralph is reduced to just the parts of his face and his body, the hands become a weapon. Golding represents the way that the human body and the human form are a weapon. And as I said just a moment ago, we don't talk about the fact that his face is being misshapen by violence. It just becomes slippery. So this is blood. There is a degree of dramatic understatement here. It's called meiosis, where you have this dramatic understatement. And it's used to disguise, in this case, not always with meiosis, but in this case to disguise violence and savagery. So again, when we're thinking about this core question of why are these boys so cruel, we just see this cruelty escalate as we move through the novel really, really rapidly, really quickly. The second two themes for this track and trace activity, you can think about why a character's shunned, and finally about the division between the boys. And those are the two areas that I would look at next if I was tracing this through. So, 3 central questions. Why does Golding focus on the cruelty of the boys? Piggy's intellect. Why is he and why are others shunned? And if the island is dividing, why? What does this say about democracy? Well, why does Golding focus on the cruelty of the boys? Well, cruelty seems inevitable. Cruelty seems to spiral out of control. Golding represents the way, it represents the loss of British values. But I take that a step further. It is the failure of British exceptionalism, the idea that the British are immune to being brutal and savage. These boys reveal that, of course, that's ridiculous and an impossibility. The fact that violence goes out of control, that cruelty is a means of suppressing reason and democracy, and of course that cruelty is part of humanity. And this is a really bleak idea that Golding represents. Cruelty is a part of humanity and that we should fear it. And in the next video we're going to consider the beast, this dark, and as well as that, some of the darkness that resides in all of humanity. But of course Simon sees that we should fear it, and perhaps that's Golding's suggestion that we should all fear the inherent cruelty of mankind. Now I'm going to propose, as a result of working through this, that we just tweak this question. Piggy has intellect, but also Simon perceives. And we do see this in this chapter if you read the rest of this chapter. But why is intellect and perception shunned? Why are intellect and perception shunned? These two positive traits. But of course, they reveal the limitations of tyranny, particularly if we consider that cruelty is related to tyranny. And we know over history that scientists who disagreed with a government's way of thinking under a tyranny, well, those scientists were imprisoned. They were no longer allowed to speak. Those who spoke out entirely reasonably and rationally against tyranny, they were imprisoned. Those who saw and perceived were imprisoned. So this is Golding commenting on anyone who disagreed with a tyrant was imprisoned. Anyone who doesn't fit a racial, physical, ethnic, or intellectual, in terms of how you think, ideal, is ostracised, dislocated, and forced out. And we can certainly think about the way Golding is responding to the issues raised during the Second World War, the rise of the extreme right, the rise of extreme fascism, the rise in Germany, in the Nazi Party, to suppress freedom of speech, freedom of thought, to castigate, stigmatise, and remove the rights of, for example, the Jewish community. And perhaps, given everything that's going on in the world in the latter part of the 20th century, and as this video is published in June 2020, perhaps we need to consider the fact that actually as a society, there is still this terrifying, fearsome force that suppresses people in the world, that suppresses people because of their racial identity, because of their beliefs, because of their religion, because of their faith, because of how they think and their refusal to engage in the world. Perhaps William Golding's novel speaks to some of those issues today. What does this say about democracy? If this island is dividing, if there is division, what does this say about democracy? That perhaps, as we've seen again and again, that it is frail, that it is vulnerable, that democracy needs to be protected. Golding shows us the need to unite and heal rather than divide. We see in this chapter, in chapter 4 of Lord of the Flies, that the boys are starting to separate and divide. We see by the end of the novel the damage and destruction that is caused as a result of that. And perhaps this is Golding saying to us very clearly that rather than dividing and separating and refusing to follow democratic values, that it is those very same democratic values that should protect us, that need to be cherished most strongly. And Golding, writing in the middle of the 20th century, when some of those things felt very fragile, very uncertain, very nervous, very tense, is communicating that particularly clearly.